My name is Yvonne. I'm sitting in my car, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, an envelope clutched tightly to my chest. The echoes of my father's angry shouts still ring in my ears, and I'm taken back to that fateful moment in the conference room. It was a Thursday afternoon, and we were all gathered in a small, wood-paneled conference room downtown for my grandfather's will reading. The long oval table was bathed in the soft, filtered light that slipped through the half-drawn Venetian blinds. I'd been in rooms like this countless times in my professional life as a lawyer, but today, sitting on this side of the table, I felt small and exposed. My father, Mr. Henry Thompson, a stern and business-minded man, sat across from me. He always carried an air of authority, his graying hair neatly combed and his suit perfectly pressed. My mother, Mrs. Linda Thompson, was a kind-hearted woman who often tried to keep the peace in the family. My brother Ethan was a charming and ambitious young man with big dreams of starting his own tech company. Aunt Lily was there too, along with two cousins I hardly knew. The attorney, Mr. Wallace, a soft-spoken man with wire-rimmed glasses, began by going through the standard items in the will. The family house, the savings, and various personal belongings were distributed among family members by name. As expected, my father received the bulk of it. Ethan got grandfather's antique pocket watch, a beautiful piece that grandfather had carried with him for decades. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, trying to stay calm and just get through it. Then, Mr. Wallace paused. He looked down at his papers and then directly at me. He said there was an additional item, a sealed envelope that grandfather had left with instructions to be given only to me at this reading. He slid the envelope across the table. My name was written on the front in grandfather's shaky handwriting. I felt the room go still. I could feel my father's eyes on the envelope, and Ethan seemed to withdraw into himself. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a 3-page handwritten letter and a certified document from grandfather's private account. It was a transfer authorization in my name for a significant amount of money, enough to change my life and start something of my own. But at first, I hardly noticed the number because I was engrossed in the letter. Grandfather had written it 14 months earlier, 4 months after my graduation dinner. Somehow, he'd found out what had happened that night at the Ivy, an upscale restaurant downtown where we'd gone to celebrate our graduation. I remembered that graduation day like it was yesterday. Ethan and I were graduating from the same university, but from different programs. He'd completed his MBA, while I'd finished my law degree. It had been 5 long years of late nights, studying by the light of a desk lamp, and eating instant noodles. I'd sat in the auditorium, thinking that this was the day when things would finally be equal between us. My father had made a reservation at the Ivy to celebrate. I'd thought it was for both of us, a recognition of our hard work. But halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat and set down his fork. That small, deliberate sound still haunts me. He looked at Ethan with a warm, proud smile, the kind I'd rarely seen him give me. He said he'd been thinking for a long time about how to help Ethan start his tech startup. Then he slid an envelope across the table. It contained $1 million wired into an account he'd already opened in Ethan's name. The table went quiet. My mother smiled nervously, and Aunt Lily gasped. Ethan looked stunned at first, then grateful, and finally, he seemed to accept it as his due. I waited, telling myself there was another envelope for me, that my father was building up to something. I even picked up my water glass to have something to hold. Then he looked at me. His eyes were cold, and his expression was flat. He said, "Yvonne, you're smart. You'll figure it out on your own." And with that, he picked up his fork and continued eating. I don't remember how I got through the rest of the meal. The drive home was a blur, and that night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I'd misunderstood. But I'd spent years learning to read people and situations precisely, and there was no mistaking what my father had done. He'd chosen Ethan over me. What hurt wasn't the money. I had job prospects, and I was capable of making my own way. It was the look on his face, the complete dismissal, as if he'd already decided my worth was zero. After graduation, I passed the bar exam 4 months later and took a job at a mid-sized law firm in the city. I worked long hours, billed my clients, and paid my own rent. I told myself and my friends that I was fine, but deep down, I was quietly unraveling every belief I'd ever had about my family. Ethan's startup launched 8 months after graduation. My father attended the launch party, and there were photos online of them together, smiling and celebrating. I liked the post because I didn't know what else to do. I saw my father only on holidays, and our conversations were always surface level, filled with small talk and an uncomfortable silence. About a year after graduation, my grandfather, Mr. Oscar Thompson, passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83. We all flew back home for the funeral. I sat in the third pew, looking at the flowers, and remembered how he used to call me his firecracker when I was a little girl, saying I had a spirit that could light up a room. The funeral was hard, and the days after were even harder. Then came the will reading, and everything I thought I knew about my family was shattered. As I read grandfather's letter, I couldn't hold back my tears. He wrote that he'd watched me work hard my entire life and that he was sorry I'd grown up in a family where my efforts were often overlooked. He said he didn't believe in punishing capable people, and he loved my father but couldn't condone his actions at that dinner table. By the time I reached the second page, my shoulders were shaking and I was sobbing. Aunt Lily reached across the table and put her hand on mine. My mother had tears in her eyes, even though she hadn't read the letter. Then my father's chair scraped back. He stood up, his face turning a deep, mottled red. He looked at Mr. Wallace and said there must be a mistake. His voice was controlled at first, but then he started shouting. He said his father had no right to make such a private financial decision without consulting the family. He claimed it needed to be reviewed by an attorney, and I almost laughed, sitting there as a lawyer myself. He said grandfather hadn't been in his right mind at the end, a cruel and transparent lie. Aunt Lily stood up and told him to stop, but he got louder. He pointed at the envelope, at Mr. Wallace, and finally at me. He said I'd somehow influenced grandfather and that it wasn't fair. The word fair coming from him was almost laughable, considering what he'd done to me at the restaurant. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and picked up the certified document. I looked at my father, really looked at him, for the first time since that painful dinner. I said nothing. I'd learned that the best way to deal with his anger was to stay silent, to let him hear himself and let the room hear his outburst. He eventually stopped, like a storm that runs out of energy. I thanked Mr. Wallace, hugged Aunt Lily, and walked out into the afternoon light. I sat in my car for a long time, holding the envelope to my chest, thinking about grandfather and how he'd seen me when it mattered most. 18 months later, I used that inheritance to open my own law practice. It started small, just me, a paralegal named Sarah, and an office filled with second-hand furniture and some plants that I refused to let die. But it grew, and it kept growing. Every morning when I unlock the front door of my office, I think about grandfather's letter. I don't need my father's approval anymore. I stopped waiting for it somewhere between the will reading and the first time a client cried in my office because I'd gotten them a result no one else believed was possible. That feeling, that sense of accomplishment and validation, is worth more than any amount of money or any approval from my father.